that happening? Because it isn't only an issue of individual privacy, but it's also one of security for our countries. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mrs. Muscardini. Now for 1.5 minutes, Mrs. Boskurt.
Geachte voorzitter, geachte commissaris.
Thank you, President, Commissioner. Well, an agreement that was concluded behind closed doors was not something that the European Union citizens want. The European Union is negotiating on a very important agreement, and it's doing so behind closed doors. The European Parliament and the national parliaments have not been able to carry out democratic controls on the negotiations themselves. Negotiations are taking place in secret. The European Parliament and the citizens of Europe once again have found themselves out of the loop. The trust of the European citizens in the European institutions is declining day by day. That in the fight against terrorism, but in other fields as well. Intellectual property rights are an important field for the citizens of Europe, but we do not want to create uncertainty regarding the negotiating documents. I'd like to know exactly how communication takes place between the Commissioner responsible for freedom of information and the Commissioner responsible for trade issues. How did this take place? Perhaps Mrs. Reding at some point asked the Commissioner responsible for trade exactly what was happening and whether or not the European Parliament should not be involved in the agreement.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Boskurt. Now Mrs. Lichtenberger for 1.5 minutes.
Herzlichen Dank.
Thank you very much. Commissioner, transparency was one of the words that was most used during the hearings for the commissioners recently. And you again have said that everything is open and everything is transparent. But I have to say, this is a definition of transparency that I can't subscribe to, and that clearly goes for many other members of the House here this evening. Transparency is more than just throwing out a few piecemeal bits of information and then saying we can't disclose the rest because we've agreed that it would all remain confidential. We are now in a new era. We will not just blindly go ahead with international trade agreements if it is then going to influence EU legislation down the line. That, under Lisbon, is no longer possible. So, blindly following the line is not going to cut it anymore, and nor is holding back documents for the European Parliament. Credibility is the big word here. But you're not going to win credibility if everything goes on behind closed doors. And if you try and calm people down by saying it's really not so bad after all, that, Commissioner, is the wrong way to go.
Thank you, Mrs. Lichtenberger. And now Mrs. Catherine Troutman for 1.5 minutes. Thank you, President, Commissioner, colleagues. Let's say it very clearly, the way in which negotiations have been carried out on the ACTA agreement is simply not acceptable for the European Parliament. As a new co-legislator on the subject, the Lisbon Treaty now guarantees us a right to full information at exactly the same time as the Council receives it. Up to now, we haven't seen any documents, so we've been able to see that this principle is no longer being respected. So the so-called market that's been proposed to internet operators is that if they go along with surveillance of the contents going through their networks, then the non-responsibility they have in this area will be maintained. Otherwise, they will be subject to pursuit and they will be sanctioned. But I think it's completely dangerous to reverse the situation so much, because it would call into question the community acquis, not only with respect to the principle of mere conduit under the directive, but also with respect to fundamental rights of citizens. Let me refer you to our recent debates on the telecom package. I'll conclude by saying that our House has already shown that it's very attached to these principles by rejecting the SWIFT agreement, and I have absolutely no doubt that it's able to do that again. The resolution we're debating tonight is very important, and I welcome the work done by our coordinator, Kader Arif, and all the members of INTER to make sure that the message given by the European Parliament tomorrow will be very symbolic, because it's unanimous. Thank you. Thank you. Let's now move on to the Catch the Eye speeches. There's just been one request. I'll give the floor for 1 minute to Yorgos Papastankos.
Η παραποίηση προϊόντων δεν πλήττει μόνο την ανταγωνιστικότητα.
Counterfeiting does not just harm the competitiveness of European business, it also has dangers for human health. So we need to strengthen international property rights at a worldwide level. What we need is an increasing number of economic partners in the multilateral agreements. Of course, these agreements need to respect community acquis 100%. They need to respect fundamental freedoms and private law. They need to ensure information flows. And we need to ensure that there's no additional administrative burden. The European Parliament needs to have full information at all stages of the negotiation, of course respecting the confidentiality clauses that apply.
Thank you very much. Last speaker,